Welcome to my channel on the best of fantasy. Today I would like to talk about the Long Price Quartet. Having just finished The Price of Spring, book 4 in the Long Price Quartet, I have many thoughts. And I have said several times in my reviews of the first 3 books, as well as during my discussions with my fellow booktubers, that I am a big-time admirer now of Daniel Abraham's abilities as a writer. And I want to focus in this video on some of those things that I feel he does especially well. So you could think of this as a kind of why you should read the Long Price Quartet video. Although I know that's sort of, I guess, how people frame these things. It's really more of a why I love the Long Price Quartet, why I find it compelling. But maybe you'll find it compelling for some of the same reasons that I do. So this will be spoiler free. I'm not going to spoil anything for any of the books, so we'll steer clear of spoilers. However, I will be hosting a discussion of The Price of Spring, and that will happen in probably early June. And the usual gang that I've been with for the previous discussions in the books of the Long Price Quartet will be there, and that includes Alan and also Sarah, and of course Nico and Andrew and Zara hopefully will be joining us. But I am going to be the host this time, and I think I'll begin that discussion by asking them to reflect on some of the things that I'm reflecting on. Why I love this series so much. And so they'll begin with that with a non-spoiler kind of thing to hopefully entice more people to read the series, or at least let them know why we think it's fantastic. And then we'll get into the spoilers. So we'll get, for those of you who have read the series and want to get into the juicy details, that will happen in early June on my channel, and I'm sure it will be a not just Price of Spring discussion, but an LPQ discussion in general. So it's going to be a lot of fun, and I'm very much looking forward to that. It is happening in early June once again, a little ways off because we had to find a time that worked for everybody. So there it is. All right, well, in terms of the Long Price Quartet, I'll do my sell here. Why I love the Long Price Quartet, why perhaps you might want to read it. If you're interested in a deep psychological study of characters that you'll come to love and feel like you know the actual people in your life, this might be something you would enjoy. And you watch these characters, some of them from their youth all the way to their old age in the series of these 4 surprisingly compact books. These are not big, long chunkers. These are actually very quick reads in some respects. They're very thoughtful, so they're not fast-paced, but they are, in terms of word count and page count, they're not that long, really. It's surprising how much of a feel for a life Abraham is able to instill in these books, in these relatively few pages of these 4 books. It's really quite astounding. Also, if you're in the mood for books that are beautifully written with prose that is accomplished and I would say even masterful at times, but doesn't really call attention to itself, then this might also be something of interest for you. The prose is really quite accessible, and it's not something you stumble over or you feel it interferes at any point with comprehension. On the other hand, it can be very beautiful at times too. Abraham is very skilled with description. There are some really just very apt phrases in there. And I am somebody who likes to pause on a well-crafted sentence, and there were many of those moments for me in here. So I have a ton of respect. That's not an easy thing to do, to have a distinguishable style and yet have prose that doesn't call attention to itself, that serves the story, actually, quite effectively. So that's another thing that I feel is a factor that highly recommends this series. And if you're fascinated by the conflicts that define not only our inner struggles, our inner lives, the psychology of the mind, but also the conflicts that define our relationships with others, then this might just be the series for you, because Abraham is an absolutely top-notch character writer. His ability to delve into the minds of his characters and to explore their conflicts, particularly in relation to other characters. And I've compared him to Hob, which is really, I think, a great compliment to anyone to be compared to Robin Hobb, who I consider to be one of the greatest character writers in literature, period. He does especially relationships well. I think Abraham is similar. I think that he's actually more concise than Hobb, at least in the Long Price Quartet. But they both have a similar ability to bring out a character's personality, especially through the relationships with the other characters, and give a sense of the richness of that relationship, the layers of it, the complexity of it, the conflict, because you'll have characters who both love and hate other characters in this series. And it's convincing. It is compelling. It is absolutely fascinating to see how these characters' struggles play out and how they come and meet as different people at different stages of their lives, and how the earlier stages define those later moments in ways that are incredibly impactful. So absolutely brilliant stuff as far as, and then maybe the greatest part of this series, in fact, is the character work. It's just, you can tell that Daniel Abraham is really invested in his characters, that this is what fascinates him probably as a writer, would be my guess, is human beings and how we work, and how crazy and conflicted we are, and how sometimes we do things that are harmful for ourselves and the people around us, and thinking all the while that we're doing a great thing. And the conflict between our own selfishness and our altruism and our desire to love others mixed with our own, selfish motives. It's just a lot of really incredible, great work on the characters. Also, if you're up for a unique, and I mean that word here, unique magic system that involves the personification of the abstract through poetry, then the Long Price Quartet might just be for you. It's a fascinating magical system that Abraham has conceived of here, and it supports the story. It is not something that gets explained overly, so definitely on the side of soft magic, there's quite an element of mystery to it. There is some explanation of how it works, but largely it is a product of the suspension of disbelief for you to go along, and it wasn't difficult for me at any stage. I actually found it very interesting as somebody who's interested in language, who's interested in the ways that language informs fantasy as a genre, how Abraham focused his magical system, if you will, around poetry, around the power of the word, around the power of grammar. So I really enjoyed his magical system. And another thing that I think you might find really compelling about the Long Price Quartet is definitely the world building. The setting is just incredible. The richness of the cultures, and again, in relatively little space, the richness of the cultures that Abraham introduces here is really quite astounding, especially for the city-states of the Khayyam, which have without being able to just put your finger on exactly which part of Asia that this might be inspired by in terms of the setting, you can just sort of say this seems like a sort of an Asian feeling kind of inspired setting. For me, at times it felt South Asian, but other times perhaps a little more East or Southeastern Asian. But I think what he's done is very effective in terms of just creating a world that is itself a unique creation that is not exactly like any particular place in the world in the city-states of the Khayyam. And I love the exploration of communication that Abraham has in here. I've commented on this in my review of the very first book, and I remain fascinated by how he's built in this whole system of not exactly sign language, but postures and poses that modify the spoken word or enhance it or even contradict it. So the city-states of the Khayyam have a communication style that both relies on oral language, but also on poses that convey various nuances. And these are things that the various characters will use at times to contradict what they're saying, or to convey a level of affection or respect, or something that goes unspoken but is communicated nonetheless. So a very, what I've called, high context culture, where you have to really read into the body language to really understand what's being said, because sometimes what's being said orally is really not the correct message. So there are lots of nuances in there, and something that he conveys without, again, calling a ton of attention to it, really. Maybe you'll notice it more in the first book, but then as you get immersed in the world, it's just sort of, you're along for the ride, and it's just part of the story, these various gestures and poses and things that do add an interesting element to the story. So that's another great thing about this series, is the world building. So all of these things really are for me, selling points. However, on the other hand, if you are someone who, at the moment, you're wanting an action-packed, fast-paced, plot-centered read, then perhaps the Long Price Quartet is not for you at the moment. The greatest tension in the story is not within the plot. It's not within the action. In fact, a lot of the action scenes that the events build up toward just happen really fast. They're over. You blink and you miss it, kind of thing. Which is, I think, true to the way things work in real life. A lot of the most impactful events happen in just boom, and they're over. So that is something that perhaps Abraham is also just conveying here as a truth of our lives, that the really big things happen really fast, and we spend a lot of our time either building up to those moments or dealing with the consequences of those moments. And that's what the characters do in the series. We spend a lot of time anticipating, and then also, I would say, looking back and dealing with the consequences of particular events. And the events themselves aren't really necessarily the major focus, as they would be in a probably more plot-centered story. It's really more about the people and the aftermath of the events, and how they're dealing with the events, and their relationships with each other. So something that I found to be very interesting, fascinating, and worth reading. It had me glued to the page in a way that is different from the way I'm often glued to a page in a more plot-driven kind of story. So I really enjoyed it a lot. So to talk about the characters a little bit more in detail, I think that what Abraham does here in characters like Mati and Ota and Idan, he gives us some... I mean, these were characters that I felt like by the end of this, I was an old friend to these people. In some cases, maybe not friend isn't the right word, but they were nevertheless people that I was fascinated by and felt like I had known for a very long time. And so I found that just absolutely just breathtaking at times to see a life play out before me like that. And even with these gaps in between where I don't know exactly all the details of their lives in between the 4 books, but somehow I felt like all that got filled in the process of reading the book. So very effectively done. And the themes, oh my goodness. So Daniel Abraham, a very thoughtful writer. Obviously, he's someone who's going to be thinking about what themes, and you can see it in the very title of the series, The Long Price Quartet. So 4 books, but we're really talking about the long price here. And in terms of price, what he's exploring is the price that we pay for having a society as it is, the way it is. The price for being in relationships with other people with whom we have to figure out how to get along. The price for security, our own personal security, or our security as a culture that is in a possibly antagonistic relationship with another culture. So there is the price of ambition, a major price we pay for our ambitions, our goals in life. What sacrifices are we prepared to make to achieve those goals? And will we regret it in the end? This is something that he explores so effectively. And of course, there's the price of living itself, the price of life, where we have thousands of losses, little and large, that we face throughout the course of our years. Yet another thing that Abraham does in terms of themes, one that he explores very effectively in here, I would say, is the nature of redemption. And this has a lot to do with following the characters along the long courses of their lives. And the question of what is redemption? Is redemption possible? Are there things that you can do that make you irredeemable? Are there things that you do for which you will pay a price? And does that price redeem you? So this is something that without getting into details, I found incredibly interesting and compelling about the way he tells these stories, is looking at redemption in the case of several characters. And when I have the spoiler discussion, I will give those examples because I find them so fascinating to think about. And overall, these are just beautiful books that moved me incredibly. They were, in addition to all the, I'm telling you about how I felt they were compelling in terms of my intellectual curiosity, but I also found them emotionally fulfilling. They moved me to tears, especially the final book, The Price of Spring, which is a fantastic book. It is my favorite of the series. But I will say that The Price of Spring would not be what it is without the first three books having paved the way, having these three books giving me a sense of these characters and their journeys and their lives, and adding all these layers that made The Price of Spring such an effective ending. It was by far my favorite of the four books, but I enjoyed all four of them, in fact. And even though the first book begins slowly, I quickly put my trust in Daniel Abraham because I could see that what he was doing was building up a world, building up characters, and there's some amazing payoff for that investment. So absolutely, this is a writer who has earned my trust, and I also think that there are some incredible, iconic moments in here as well. And I'm not going to get too detailed about that, but there was the reintroduction in The Price of Spring of a certain character, and there were several long-awaited reunions that had a lot of tension to them, a lot of build-up to those moments, to the very end where I just could not hold in my tears. Just so happy that I read this series, and I have to mention specifically Alan here because he is the person who convinced me to read this series, the Long Price Quartet. Shouting out about it, he is the Long Price Prophet. That is a title that he has earned, and I have to take my hat off to you, Alan, for being absolutely correct about the amazing nature of this series. So you were absolutely right. It's absolutely going to be a favorite of mine. I don't know how I'm ever going to make another top 10 video because I keep finding series that are mind-blowingly awesome. But this is a series that I will be mentioning again and again as one that I think people should give a try. So those are my thoughts for now, and thank you for watching this. Until next time.